go there. It's really just spoken form, but I thought it'd be good to at least prepare a few facts so we could ground ourselves.
Okay. Good? Okay. All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Kristin Leutz. I work with RefugePoint, and we've been fortunate to be supported by the great team here at Infusion, and also have been here before with... That's okay. Should we do it?
Thank you, Remy.
Okay. They told me I could just roll right in, but here we go. Now I've got your attention. I'll start again. It's Kristin Leutz from RefugePoint. We are based in Cambridge. We also have a team in Nairobi, and we'll talk a little bit about what we do. But first, I just want to thank Infusion, because this is a company who not only wants to support causes like ours, but also is interested in learning. So it'll be the second visit I've made here. Last time we came with a wonderful young woman who's a client of ours when she was a child and is now a full-time student. And this year will be a published author. If anyone saw Sandra when she came, does anyone remember meeting her? Yeah, so Sandra's book is going to be coming out with HarperCollins. We'll see a lot more about her. She's an amazing voice just to represent the potential that refugees have to be assets in our world, which given these times is an important thing to remind ourselves of. So I'll start out with a little bit about RefugePoint. So we started 10 years ago. We specialized in really improving the resettlement space, which is a large international system run essentially by UNHCR and all over the world. But we focused in Africa because actually the largest amount of the total global resettlement numbers was coming out of Africa and still continues to come out of places in Africa. And we saw there was a sort of gap in the system, especially at the front end, in getting people ready for the process of resettlement. It takes often years and many sets of interviews and sometimes more complex assessments if the cases are very at risk. And that's who we specialize working with. So an example would be children. They need a special kind of interview and process to make sure that resettlement is in their best interest. We do that. We specialize in that and go all over really the world to train other UNHCR staff to specialize in that as well, because those were the cases that often were left behind. And really they were the ones who were in the most need of the life-saving solution of resettlement. So to think about a refugee's journey, and we'll talk about some stories today of a few people that are being affected right now by the Trump's ban. But generally, there's, people have fled because of violence, persecution in their home country. They end up in a host country, and they can live there for many years trying to go through the process of being resettled. And during that time, they often face new and additional dangers. So with resettlement, we knew that we could improve that system, and we've since resettled over 37,000 people. The three options for refugees really are to either go back home if it's safe for them to do that, which in most cases it is not. They can get resettlement, which is a very available to very few people, but is truly a life-saving solution, and it brings them to a new life in the US or Canada or Australia. And then the third option we also work in, which is what we call self-reliance or stabilization. And basically that's just helping refugees in the host country where they have fled to develop some kind of life where they no longer have to be dependent on aid. As we know, the global refugee aid system, the humanitarian response, is overstressed, not necessarily meeting the needs of 23 million refugees. And so we need to begin looking as a humanitarian field at other solutions. So in addition to innovating in the resettlement space, we also have been innovating in creating a holistic program that we operate out of Nairobi and are now scaling and expanding, convincing others to adopt in other places, in other cities. So this program in Nairobi, you can see here, we're serving about 500 people this year with what we call a graduation based model, and that means we've been working with them maybe for 18 months, maybe even a little longer, to just completely stabilize their lives. So any service they need, we wrap around, we provide health care for them, social work to help maybe recover from trauma. We try to help get the children in school and pay tuition fees for that, make sure they have safe housing if they've been a victim of gender-based violence. All of those things we look into. And then eventually we get them to a livelihoods grant, where it's a small business grant to start up a small business. And so examples are barber shops, small food stands. Women often sell this beautiful fabric kitenge or make things out of it. And we're able to give them very small microloans that kind of get them up and running. And at that point, we say, yeah, you're ready to graduate. So just some of the things here, again, health services, food assistance, educational support, counseling, and business loans. And so out of Nairobi, we're doing that, and we reach about 10,000 people also by employing refugees themselves who are in the community and can help us identify the people who are in the most risky, dangerous situations to help because they're often hiding and living in the shadows. And then those refugees also continue to spread information and resources out to the refugee community, even if they don't become a core client of ours. So any questions? Yeah.
So for the health services,
yep.
Are you working with any big pharmas, et cetera, to like...
So we are providing prescriptions to some of our clients. We have a clinic that's there on site. We also have these community navigators, we call them, who have a healthcare team that they can be empowered to go out into neighborhoods and visit with clients who maybe just need some simple care or information at their home, and they don't have to come to the clinic. But we're not developing relationships with big organizations. Right, because it's actually a fairly small universe of people that need these services that we're working with. The other thing that we have done, though, which is an example of partnership, is work with the Kenyan Ministry of Health to be able to pay healthcare premiums and be able to have refugee clients access the Kenyan healthcare system, which is something that I don't think anyone else has done yet, but it's an example of what we call mainstreaming, where including refugees and other services that the host country provides is a really important step to urban refugees being able to rely on themselves and integrate into a host community where they really have no legal rights. They wouldn't otherwise have the right to be on the healthcare system. So that's what we're doing. Right, right. No, we're essentially, providing that, paying for the prescriptions and distributing them. Yeah.
You mentioned at-risk refugees, but I imagine that you talked about like the people who maybe fled alone, so they don't have a support system. What do you classify as a?
We had Oh, sure. So the question was, what makes a refugee, one, more at risk than another? As we know, all refugees have suffered quite a bit, have been in very dangerous situations, and are still living in limbo. The average time someone stays a refugee now is 17 to 20 years. So they don't necessarily get to be resettled or go home or, get integrated legally into the country. So they're living in a state of limbo. They're living without resources. And you're right, often most refugees, as part of their story, have been separated from family and from their community. And so they are living alone or have to make new communities, and sometimes even miraculously will reunite with family members after being lost from each other for quite some time. And our clients, we do see that in Nairobi. It does happen. But what makes one refugee more at risk than another? Examples might be unaccompanied minors. I mean, these are children who either were lost from their parents when an attack happened in their village, or, just had to flee on their own and somehow ended up in the care of a kind stranger who's taken them on. But we may know that kind stranger, we just want to make sure that's a safe situation for them, because it's not always. So our child protection experts will go in and understand the living situation the child has, knowing that there are no parents around. Maybe siblings are taking care of the child, but that's not working because the sibling can't provide. So that's an example of, someone who's incredibly vulnerable and really has no other resources, would be a child. And 50% of the refugees really that we're dealing with are women and children. Women have often been victimized gender-based violence and often can be pursued or continue to be pursued by people that were victimizing them earlier. So an example might be a woman who was divorced, and people from the husband's kind of village will continue to chase her and try to kill her. We have a woman that actually, we'll talk about later, affected by the travel ban, who was in that kind of danger. And she really needs safe housing and protection, and that's something that we can provide. So, there are other reasons. Like we work with LGBTI refugees who have particular, even in Kenya, now that they've fled there, they face new kinds of persecution and danger. And so we're working with that population with someone who specializes in helping them, that we've been able to work with UNHCR to kind of have different and better services for that population, because they are, again, more at risk than someone else might be. Any other questions? So I just wanted to bring folks up to date on Trump's executive order. This has really been rocking our world, at least for the last few weeks, and has definitely impacted very dramatically the lives of some refugees. And so we'll talk about some of those stories. But I wanted to begin first with just a grounding in the facts. So this began on January 27th. Trump signed his order called Protecting the Nation from Foreign Terrorist Entry into the United States. And it took immediate effect, as we know, to much chaos and confusion. But the key points here are that it bars admission to the U.S. from people of 7 countries, and they're listed there: Iraq, Iran, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, and Yemen, and that ban would be for 90 days. But it also bars entry to all refugees from anywhere in the world for 120 days. Indefinitely banning people from Syria, so there's no horizon where Syrians will be allowed to resettle to the U.S. again right now, and also is mentioning a preference for religious minorities, as we know, which is the part that has been challenged in court, and we'll talk about that later, among many other things. And it rolls back resettlement. This is an important point. From 100,000 was the number that we were supposed to be able to resettle to the U.S. this year, to 50,000, which is the level that we were resettling in the U.S. maybe 4 to 5 years ago. The numbers were raised because of the increasing global refugee crisis, the recognition from more and more people who are displaced and on the move, and the ability for the U.S. to give those people safe and new lives and a new chance here. So President Obama had set that 100,000 target. President Trump is now rolling that back to 50. And this is actually one thing that the president has exclusive control over, is the setting the numbers and figuring out for the program how many are resettled. So before we move on, any questions just on the order itself or confusion, things you may have heard in the news that you want any clarification on? Yeah. So, I mean, basically, after the protests and all the chaos was erupting in the airports, there were things that really weren't outlined in the ban that started happening. As we know, people with green cards were denied entry or detained. 17 states actually filed briefs that, said this is causing too much harm. We need to put a freeze on it. And it can't also discriminate on basis of religion, which is a part that's definitely was implied in the ban, if not stated outright. And so many people were saying it's a Muslim ban, but if you read the executive order, he doesn't mention that in particular at all. But this is something that de facto everybody, including these 17 states that filed the briefs, recognized and took issue with. And the federal district court judge, James Robart, this is the one that actually lifted the sort of practice of this, and people were able to travel again. So this last point was the most important. It happened on February 3rd. So from January 27th to February 3rd, people were not allowed to travel. Even though they said there would be exceptions in special cases, there really weren't. And then after Feb 3rd, we were allowed to start sending people in on a very limited basis. But it's not that, the gates are back open and it's all operating as normal. So to just explain a little bit about that, the court order that Judge Robart made doesn't restrict anything except for certain elements of the ban. So Trump's ability to set the number of refugees is not contested at all. So even if some parts of the ban are right now on hold, the fact of the matter is we're still not allowed to bring as many people in. And that isn't going to change, even if the courts continue to fight it out with President Trump. So we work with a refugee council of other refugee serving agencies, and together have been advocating for a repeal of this ban, a full repeal, but even also just looking at the numbers and asking for from 50 to 80,000 slots. So right now the advocacy in our peer field is to try to get that number back up as close to 100,000 as we can. So 32,000 had already traveled this year on the way up to that 100,000, and 67,000 people had been approved and in the pipeline to travel very soon. So those 67,000 people are really the ones that are most directly affected by this ban, because they essentially had their ticket to freedom and it's been ripped from their hands. So now, if you think about it, because we'd already put 32,000 through, we'll only have 18,000 left to resettle for the remainder of the year, which is an incredibly small number given the need. So this is one of the big points that we can focus on, is just trying to advocate to President Trump and appeal to him to raise that number above what he had originally put in the executive order. So the 67,000 people, the people that are affected, I mean, what is important to know is that this is going to lead to an extremely dangerous situation for people and possibly loss of life. So examples of that would be cases, a medical case. So we have a young boy who's from the Democratic Republic of Congo, 12 years old, was pursued by a tribe called the Mai Mai, who attacked his family and attacked him so brutally that they crushed his hip with the butt of their gun, and he's since had health problems. He made his way to Nairobi. Someone kind took him in and helped him, but he then was diagnosed with cancer, in part as a result of his injuries. And so this young boy has been waiting in Nairobi to get treatment for his cancer, and had been approved to travel because he can get the right treatment here in the States. And now, essentially, you know, his ticket had been rescinded at that point in time. And in Kenya, there happens to be a doctor's strike, so he's not able to get treatment there. So these are the kinds of things, when we say life and death, it really could make the difference for someone who's in a position like that young boy. There are other people who have really ongoing safety concerns that were ready to go and couldn't as well.
Those cases for a lot of countries.
Yep. Yes, in fact, we do, as part of our 37,000 we've actually resettled people to Canada, Australia, other countries. Those are the two biggest besides the U.S., but far and away the United States was taking the most refugees. So a number of slots available in Canada and Australia this year wouldn't meet the total need of people that we are essentially abandoning. But we are trying to actually work with the Canadian ministry to up those numbers. They have a private sponsorship model in Canada, which is different than what we have here. And so the possibility for private people to say they would like to sponsor more, to change those numbers, I think the potential is pretty good in Canada that things like that can happen. And so we're working with our contacts to find the cases that need resettlement most and try to move them. But in some cases, it's not that simple. I have two examples later of family reunification. And so if there are family members here in the States, that's really the place they need to come. They can't go to Canada or Australia. Yeah.
So did the court order overturn
So that part, the 120-day ban, is temporarily now, on hold. And so there's no enforcement of that. People can travel. So we are getting some refugees through again, and cases who are travel ready can come. But again, because there are so many fewer, the total number of people, the 67, probably won't travel.
And then how was that selection being out of that 67 who are approved, or
That we don't really work at that end of the process. We work at the beginning. So the people that are at the end of the process, UNHCR staff would be making those determinations. So sometimes we'll help someone and not even really know, unless they keep in touch with us, where they ended up or when or how they were resettled. And sometimes we find out about it after they've gotten a ticket and suddenly they're here, and we can talk to them and keep in touch with them. But we're at the very front of the process. The only difference is in our Nairobi office, because so many people were being resettled out of Nairobi, we also had a resettlement team in our office and an expert there. And we actually work on the whole case from Nairobi. So it's a much smaller percentage of our annual total, but for those cases, we are closer to them and know a little bit more about it. And so in the meantime, while people are waiting to travel, we can provide them also with some services. All right. So some stories. This gentleman, I won't use his name for sort of privacy's sake, but he has been a refugee for 20 years. He was persecuted in his home country of Ethiopia and eventually found his way to Kenya. He has a wife and 6 children now, and the family managed to stay together. But he was kind of deported, really, from Kenya back to Ethiopia at one point, where he was then imprisoned and tortured. And so he suffered injuries that obviously changed his life at that point in time. And he was able to come back to Kenya and reunite with his family, but he's had grave health challenges, and he's one of the people that was set to go. After 20 years of waiting, in the next 2 months, he wasn't sure when he was going to get a ticket and the whole family would be able to come to the U.S. So his case, it's not like he's sort of waiting and then he'll be the next to go. I think that it doesn't make sense to me, but that's really how it works, where he may not be put at the front of the queue, and some of his paperwork or the documentation he needs might actually expire in that time. So for someone like this, he may have lost his chance, unfortunately. And because his case is also processed with 7 other people, it can complicate it as well. So that's one example. Another example might be the young boy who was waiting for sort of urgent medical care, and we really haven't received word yet when he'll travel. So right now we're trying to make sure that he can get whatever help he can, but knowing that there's no doctors available for him, he's living in danger and in limbo. We do have happy stories, because I felt like some of those are just so hard to take in. So these are examples of 2 people who were able to travel since the ban was lifted, and it's very happy news because they're beautiful children. And of course, when we think about the name of Trump's executive order banning terrorist entry into the United States, I mean, do they look like terrorists? I mean, I do have small children. Sometimes they can be awful, but they're definitely not terrorists. So this young boy, and actually in both cases, it's interesting. Now I'm noticing this. The parents were forced to make a very difficult choice. And if you can imagine this, the case of the young girl and her beautiful mother there, the mother had begun her resettlement process with 2 other children that she already had. And over a number of years of waiting, in their case, I think it was 5 years, the family had approval to go to America. During the time, though, she got pregnant and had just given birth to a newborn. And they said to her, if you want the newborn to be included on your case, we almost have to go back to the starting point again. So she had to make a terrible choice, and she left the newborn in the care of someone she trusted in Kenya. And so this young girl, she had not been with her mother for 4 years. She's now 4 years old. And the weekend that the ban was happening, she was set to travel. She had shown up at the airport in a beautiful new dress. She had her hair braided, and she was told she couldn't go see her mother. And this part just breaks my heart. Her first reaction was, okay, is somebody going to take my hair out now? Is that what that means? Like, she just had no idea what was happening, and she couldn't understand why she couldn't be reunited with her mother. So through a lot of people, actually some senators here in the U.S., all kinds of people advocating for her, she ended up going to Minnesota, where she was reunited with her mother. And so she was one of the first to travel. Actually, even before I think the ban was lifted, we were able to get her they were able to get her in. And this young boy, same thing, where part of his family was here already. He's 6 years old. He was waiting for resettlement and maybe wasn't going to get it, but now thankfully he has been resettled to the U.S. So there are some happy things happening, but I think the key thing to keep in mind is that refugees are already living in such a state of limbo that we can hardly imagine what that's like in our own lives. And I don't think, the gentleman we mentioned before that had the injury to his leg, he really didn't have an idea of the new U.S. president. He wasn't tracking U.S. politics. So to feel that you're relying on this and someone's told you you're about to have a major change in your life and now you think you can't, I think that even psychologically the impact is huge on people who are already fragile, who are already vulnerable. And then the fact of the matter is they may or may not get that ticket in the end because the overall numbers have reduced. So it's taking people whose lives are in danger, who already have suffered so much, waited 10, maybe 15 years, and now they know that they and their family are not going to be safe. And so that's really what this order has done to people's lives. We know in Syria the situation is quite different in that they won't necessarily be allowed. So one of the things that RefugePoint has been doing in the last couple of weeks is talking to colleagues in Jordan to see if there are some of the kind of services that we provide in Nairobi, any kind of training that we can do with staff there, if there will be work with providing livelihoods and some kind of those wraparound services in Jordan, because people won't be leaving. That's something that we're investigating to see if we can help or do in some way. So we're also thinking about our programming a little differently because of the ban. But luckily, if you remember the map, we have 26 countries. Experts are deployed to resettle refugees in all those places, and they're still in place. They're still working. We still have funding from UNHCR. They're still doing casework and keeping the pipeline initiated so that if things do clear, people can be resettled. So right now it hasn't affected their day-to-day work other than hearing these stories about people's lives and what's happening, which is, I think, pretty difficult to process. But so right now it is still open for business at UNHCR and things are moving, but we know that overall the sort of tightening of the pipeline is going to eventually have long-term real effects on the whole global resettlement system that we can't quite anticipate yet. Did I have any more? Oh, yeah. Yep. Yep. Yeah, I mean, I'll just say I'm not an immigration lawyer and I don't even play one on TV, so I think it would have been better if I could have brought an immigration lawyer pal here to talk about that. But, you know, people that had visas to travel here and come from those countries were, before the ban was sort of halted by the judge's ruling, were being restricted. And now I believe people are traveling. I know people in my community from those countries on the list were able to come back in. They had valid student visas in their case. So I think that that's part of what the massive confusion was caused, is that no one really knew what all the fine details were and how they were to be implemented. So we have colleagues at an organization called the International Refugee Assistance Project, or IRAP, and they're lawyers. That's what they do, is help with these cases, and they were right on the front lines immediately trying to sort out exactly what it meant for different people. And I think, you know, as we know, that over the weekend, I kind of put the timeline together for you. Jan's 27, the protests happened over the weekend. By Monday, we were already having legal challenges. Over the course of that weekend, the ACLU raised $24 million online, which is kind of stunning. And so they're now taking that significant capital investment and really diving into the kind of legal questions that need to be answered about how this will really be implemented going forward, if it needs to be implemented. I mean, I say all that thinking we can still advocate and push to repeal the ban, which is something that, if you're interested in this, I did want to share with you a little bit about what you can do. So speaking to your elected officials, I mean, I'm just curious, since all the activities of the past few weeks, who here maybe has made their first call to their congressman or senator ever? Has anyone done that yet? Postcards, okay. Anyone else making calls? No? So you can all do this. I had never done it before. It's actually really easy. There's just a place on the website when you go to the White House, and it says find your elected officials, and you put in your zip code and it drills it right down for you. And there's often the state office number and the DC office number, and you should call both. And sometimes you get a live person that answers, and they're very friendly, and they listen to what you have to say, and they ask you where you're from and take note of it, and it's that simple. A lot of times you'll end up leaving a message, but it's still, you know, really the main way that most average people should get involved and make our voice heard as a global community here that cares about immigrants and refugees. So I would say, if you haven't done it yet, find your elected official and make those calls and just ask them very simply to repeal the ban. That's what we're talking about at this point, is just repeal it. You know, it's like almost like it never happened. Roll it back. You can get into some detail if you've made these calls before and feel like you're at level 2. You can talk about the needs of children reuniting with family members here in the U.S., because to us, that children are always a priority. And the fact that, you know, you think about those 2 children I just showed you, if they couldn't have been reunited with family, it would be such a tragedy. So if even the ban were kept in place, but there were exceptions made, that would be an improvement over what we have currently. The second thing is, obligatory pitch. I think organizations like RefugePoint, and I can also share with you others that we trust and work with, we are not the ACLU. We are not positioned to raise $24 million overnight on the internet, but we are actually doing some of the most complicated, complex work We had a potential funder visit us in Nairobi a few months ago, and he came home and said, well, now I get the difference, that you're really dealing with the people who've run out of all other options. And there are organizations like that out there, and we are privately funded, which is one of the reasons that we can afford to work with those populations that are hidden and maybe require more complex care. And so, you know, supporting organizations like this and like us are really important, in addition to thinking about the legal community that is going to be stepping up for this fight in the coming weeks. And finally, I think the most important thing is to just do what you're doing today, to come and learn about the situation, learn about the facts of refugees, learn about what they contribute to our economy, to our world, and what they can even contribute in host countries like places like Nairobi, where they are running small businesses and providing services to the community. So I think talking about that on your social media, within your own personal networks, is really, really important. If you want great content, you can follow us on social media and retweet what we're putting out. Look at our Facebook and, you know, make comments on what we're sharing and put it out to your networks. We, you know, don't have a huge mailing list, and it could be bigger. And so one of the key things we want to do is put information out there that's accurate and right. So encouraging your friends to join our mailing list so they're getting that information too will help really spread the word. And finally, we are available to do things like this. Just show up at, let's say you have a book club or a really close CrossFit community that's into this, or I'm trying to think what else, any kind of neighborhood gathering that you can think of. We can either do a conference call, or if I'm in town, one of us can come visit and just answer questions and kind of provide a forum for people to get together and talk about this. I think that's another really powerful thing that you can all do. So that's kind of the end of the formal part. If you have other questions or things that you want to ask about, other stories I can try to think of for you. I just wanted to bring a few of the personal things in and some of the facts, so we got a little bit of both. Yeah. Yeah. So the question was, what's next with the ban, what happens, and what the timelines are. Right now, we don't have a timeline, and we are actually in limbo as well. What we do know is that if the 120 days, kind of goes through and that timeline stays true to what it was in terms of cutting the numbers, because that is the one thing that's not being challenged in the executive order right now, then we would be back to resettling, knowing that it's only about 18,000 that would come into the U.S. So right now we really don't know. I think this is going to go, I think it's going to continue to be battled out in the courts, maybe even go to the Supreme Court. I think Trump immediately, when Judge Robart issued that ruling, I don't know if anyone remembered, I almost put in a timeline here and said he was tweeting. I was like, I just wanted to put his tweets up to see what was happening when, but that was the day that he was calling him a so-called judge, and a week before that fired Sally Yates when she was going to say the Department of Justice shouldn't uphold the provisions of the ban. So I think he was talking that he was going to continue to battle and fight in court. Now, whether or not he has the appetite to do that, because a few other things have happened that he's now paying attention to. So maybe he won't fight this and will live without this ban or in some medium state of limbo. So we really don't know. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But what is that screening process
Mm-hmm.
overall?
Yeah, so the question was, what is the screening process for refugees? We, as I said, work at the front end of the resettlement process in most of the cases, meaning that we are beginning the long kind of winding process of referrals. And what that involves, it's actually so to back up for a second, it's a very intensive screening process. So the idea that frequently in the media things were said like, we don't know who's coming in, or they're just dangerous people are pouring in. That couldn't be farther from the truth. Refugees often go through a multi-year process where there are multiple different people interviewing them in depth. So when I sat through a resettlement interview, it took an hour and a half. It was from cradle to sitting in that chair, literally, for that person. Our interviewer asked everything. All the family history, all the ties are documented, everything about their flight story. And then as you can imagine, we don't want to just take that one interview as gospel. So they get tossed over to people that we have no relationship with. So that minimizes the potential for fraud. They repeat the process and ask those questions plus new follow-up questions. So everything is carefully, they go through an amazing process with multiple interviews. A full dossier is written up about each person. Family members are contacted, especially in the case of a child, so we're sure it's not a trafficking situation. So it's really just not true that we don't know who's coming. We know a lot about them. We often know because the resettlement is such a golden ticket, if you think of it that way. So few refugees, 1% will ever be accessing resettlement. There's been a process to determine that they really need it. They're at risk in some way, or there's a family that needs to be reunified. So it's also that they've been prioritized. It's not just that they've been screened, but they've also been prioritized. So people that have suffered really at the hands of the very terrorists that we say we're afraid of are the ones that are going to be able to be resettled. And so they've been victims of what we claim to be fighting against. Yes.
Marketing is like long term. Like, how do you market this to like half of America who's like hell bent on like not anyone in the face? Like, how do you market it to the people in Arkansas, right? And things like New York City, where we
Right.
like,
Yeah. No. This is.
How do you market to them that this is okay? We need them. Say something like that.
So the question was, how do we kind of market the alternate view about the truth about refugees, is what I'll call it. It really is, how do we market the truth to all parts of America? And we're a small agency. We don't have a marketing budget, We have one person on staff that is responsible for communications. And so we rely on our executive director, Sasha, has got an amazing ability to get into the media. So he's been working as part of his job this year to get into national media. He had an article in USA Today, which is more of a, kind of all-America paper. So he's not just trying to get into the New York Times. We have a volunteer here in New York who's had a long career in PR, who's trying to help us think about specific markets where there have been a lot of refugees resettled, and maybe even getting op-eds in those papers in those markets to talk about the contributions they've made. So Minneapolis would be an example. Even where we are in Boston, north of Boston, there's a community where there's a lot of people who've resettled, and they're already doing amazing things and contributing to our economy in the U.S. and our communities. So those are the kinds of stories that we try to get placed in the media, but the truth is, there are people with frequent access to, publicity and loud voices that can, speak their side more often than we get a chance to speak the truth about refugees. So it's a tough challenge. And if anyone knows marketing, come see me. I did not put that up there as a way you can help, but volunteering for organizations like ours to help us get media placement and market it better is always helpful. Yeah.
If the number of refugees allowed in the U.S. lower, focus on like getting people settled in their host countries, like will you just refocus?
So the question was about if, let's say resettlement slows to a trickle, what does RefugePoint do, or organizations like ours? Would we change our programming? And I think the reality is, yeah, we probably would have to, because we are privately funded and we can do a lot of different things. The only money that we receive is a private grant actually from UNHCR, about a third of our budget, to do that specialized resettlement work and to place those experts. But actually, when we began 10 years ago, we were funding those positions, and they liked it so much they said, we'll pay you to do even more. So if their ability to ends, they can't pay us to do even more, then we can go back to the original model of private funding and suggest that those experts that we have out in the field be redeployed to do new things. Child protection is one. It will still continue to be child protection needs. We have expertise in that. We could change their terms of engagement to focus on that. We could also think about livelihoods. So the model we've built in Nairobi, we're actually putting a lot of energy this year into working with a collaborative. We're calling it the Learning Collaborative. So a bunch of other NGOs are coming to our office in Nairobi in March to talk about the way we measure and evaluate self-reliance and get some shared agreement across the field on adopting these measures so that we could maybe roll out kind of more intensive programs like the one we have in Nairobi to other coast countries who are really going to have a whole bunch of people staying who won't have the legal rights and won't have the protections they need. So yeah, we are really doubling down on the idea of kind of scaling influence in the field to adopt more self-reliance, not necessarily us growing to do it, but encouraging other people to take that up and to go with it in their own programs. Was there a question back there? I thought I saw a hand before. No? All right. Well, I just want to thank you again for making time out of your day to care about refugees. I mean, I think we're all, we share in common the fact that we, when times are tough, rely on our community. We need our family. We need our neighbors. If we're sick, if we're hurting in any way, that's when people rally around and start a Caring Bridge website for you or make meals, all the things that we do to help each other. And, refugees have been torn from that community. So the fact is they need us energetically and spiritually and every other way to kind of stand with them in community and put resources toward them. And you've all done that today by sitting and listening, so thank you.